Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. I'm Walter Powell, and today the TeamMates Mentor Academy will be on cultural proficiency. We're very fortunate to have two leaders on cultural proficiency from our district with us today. I'll let them do their introductions. First, we have Oscar Rios and also Pete Ferguson. Okay.
Well, thank you for being here. It is our pleasure to have this conversation with you all. My name is Oscar Rios Poirier. I serve in the capacity of cultural specialist, and I also coordinate the bilingual liaison program. We have about 18 bilingual liaisons who speak more than 10 different languages, and we provide cultural and interpretation services to the entire district. So thank you for being here today.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Pete Ferguson. I have the privilege to serve LPS as the Youth Development Coordinator. As you can see, I'd ask you what's one thing we all have in common here, and we say we all visit the same barber. So we're not going to talk about the culture of being bald. That's the way we're going to open up. And so Oscar and I'd like to tell you a little bit of a story. This picture up here, we say it's more than a choice, it's a lifestyle. So being bald is not our choice, it's a lifestyle, and we've chosen to go ahead and embrace that. But the story that Oscar and I have in common, and we've had the opportunity to collaborate and work together, is we had a young man that we worked with that drew this picture for us, and he told us he was a really acclaimed artist. He said, you know what, I'm an artist, I can nail anything, I'm really talented, I'm really gifted. And so Oscar and I said, you know, why don't we just go ahead and commission you to do some art for us? And he says, what does commission mean? And I think the only thing he heard in commission was, I'm getting paid. And so he drew this picture for us, and he came and he showed it to us, and he was really proud about it. And I looked at him and I said, you know, you do have some real gifts, but if you were really gifted, you would have drawn Oscar and I with hair. And so that being said, I appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak to you a little bit about cultural proficiency and our journey and some ways that it can impact the scholars that you serve with on a daily basis. Somebody asked earlier, are we going to put you to work? And so just to get us in the right frame of mind, what I'd like you to do is you have a note card on your table, and I'd like you to listen to this piece right here, and then in 3 words, I want you to sum up your feelings that you heard while you're listening to this. So I'd like you to take a quick moment, and the 3 words or 3 things that come to your mind when you're sitting there and when you heard that song. When you heard that song articulated, what are 3 things that came to your mind? Words, the inspiration, the first 3 thoughts. Yes, sir.
Amazing, beautiful grace.
See, you're in the gifted class. You're already sharing out. We didn't even ask, so. Amazing, beautiful, and great. Okay, what else? Excuse me? Innocence. inclusive, and harmony. Anybody else? One more. Yes, ma'am.
Sharing, unity, and pride.
Sharing, unity, and pride. Okay. I'm going to lead into Oscar, but we're here to talk a little bit about cultural proficiency, and the objectives we have today is we want you to become familiar with the multicultural issues that are relevant to today's scholars and strategies that may support their fulfillment of fulfilling their fullest potential. We want you to be able to identify how prejudice and stereotypes and discrimination become barriers to positive life-impacting relationships. And then finally, we want you to be able to analyze your own prejudice and stereotypes that impact relationships with students. The reason I showed that first clip is if you go on, and if many of you remember when that came out, that some of you said inclusiveness, some of you said amazing, some of you said innocence. The things that were said about that song and that clip were all over the board. This was fantastic to this was something that is un-American. How could you destroy this song? How could you have this sung in different languages, so to speak? And when we talk about being culturally proficient, and many of you are matched with individuals that may not be like you, that may be similar to you, we talk about that being a situation is, well, that's what you deal with each and every day. The song is not always going to be sung in the same way that you would sing it. And so we hope that we provide you some insight, answer some questions, provide you with some strategies that will hopefully engage you to promote students to fulfill whatever their fullest potential might be. Quickly on some terms, and Oscar will help with this. We ask you how to define cultural proficiency, and Oscar, I'm going to let you go ahead and.
Okay, cultural proficiency. One thing that has stuck to my mind is the fact that it's not a place where one arrives at. It is lifestyle, per se. It is something that we work on a daily basis. It is the experience. 20 years ago, when I was 19, I never thought that I would be here talking about this particular theme, cultural proficiency. At that point in time, my perception and reality of a 19-year-old immigrant was people in this town are weird. My perception was the language sounds weird. I cannot master it. I cannot speak it. I do not care much about the language. As a matter of fact, in a few years, I'm going to go back to my country and forget all about it. That was my cultural perception when I was 19 years of age. You ask me at 43 how I feel about a cultural competency level. I am still working at it. That's to the best of my ability in terms of what we have seen, what we have read. That's the definition of cultural proficiency. We encourage you to every day challenge yourself. Toward the end of this presentation, we are going to take a closer look at what perception is all about, the anatomy of a perception, in the hopes that we will use that as a tool as we move forward in the area of cultural proficiency. So some terms, definitions. Diversity equals differences. Anybody at this point in time, just think about this for just a minute. And what comes to your mind when you think about diversity equals differences? Anybody? There is not a right or wrong answer. We have ideas. Age. That is right. That is right. And that's my story. I'm 43, and age has made me see things differently. And if I get to 60, my conversations with you may be different as well. Anybody else? Diversity equals differences. Gender identity. Could you expand upon that thought? Can be more than just gender. That is right. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. Economic or socioeconomics or economic positions, as you have stated. Very well. Anybody else? ethnicity. Any other ideas? Why is diversity related to differences? One more thought? Prejudice equals prejudgment. What do you guys think about that? Any ideas? What's a synonym of prejudice? Ignorance. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Anybody else? Stereotype. Thank you. Perhaps a misperception. So if you have a misperception, prejudice, stereotype, how does that affect the way you work with people? Anybody? Creates a filter. Could you expand upon that idea? I think it's you brought up something important here.
It causes you to see something. Maybe the way I was raised is different than the way everybody else was raised. I have a set of rules. I have a box. And I see everybody else the way I see them, the way I know. My rules, my eyes, my filter.
That's exactly right. In the way I see it now, I relate to what you're saying because when I was 19, coming from rural Mexico with a set list of ideas in terms of how I looked at the physical universe, that was my world. And that should be the world for everybody else. And if you are not part of that world, then you are not my friend. I'm just being honest. That's how it was. And anything else in terms of the language, the food, the interactions, the buildings, the grocery stores, which did not fit into my universe, then that was awkward. And that's what we're trying to do today by being here. Take a look at those stereotypes, take a look at our thoughts, and then have an honest conversation with ourselves. Are those thoughts, are those perceptions the reality of things as I live my life? That's what we are going to be doing in the next few minutes. Stereotypes, as someone mentioned back there, equals overgeneralization, as you all brought up. And then stereotypical statements often begin with all, right? Yes? I'm sorry, I wasn't able to hear the last part of your question. Could you? That is an amazing question. Do all small children, or do the little ones, have already that stereotype, prejudice that perhaps grown-ups have or older humans have? In my estimation, stereotypes, perceptions, misperceptions, judgment is a learned behavior. It is a learned behavior. We grow up in environments of violence. We grow up in environments of genocide. We grow up with families who have not been educated to a certain extent. So we learn from them through examples. And that's how we began to generate our own ideas. Am I making sense? My parents did not go to, and I'm just telling you this because I'm just being honest. My parents didn't have the opportunity to go to school. So when I asked them, how can I go to college, Mom? She said, ask your dad. I went to my dad, and he said, you know what, I don't know. They did not have that background information, so my perception was one of confusion. Am I making sense? But we have the power to interact with others. We have the power to communicate with others. And through education, we have the power to change our own perspectives. And that's what we're trying to do today. Discrimination equals prejudice. And then it may sound redundant. It may sound redundant here. But discrimination, in my estimation, comes from a misperception. That's the way I see it. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the questions that were brought up by you. And Walter, would you like to guide us through that process? But if you want to, we have an activity that I think is going to help us as we move into the actual questions here. I think we have, how much time do we have anyway? 12, 19? Okay, so we are all right. We are going to work a little bit. This is going to be interactive. So I want everyone to stand up, if you would, please. I want each of you to find a partner. Just move around, find someone who you think will want to work with you. All right? Or find someone who you think needs to work with you. All right, so once you make yourself comfortable, just make eye contact. I want you guys to just introduce yourself, just tell them who you are, and then you'll be ready for this next step. We may not get to all of the questions here, but the idea behind is you want to get to know that person, all right? Why don't you, according to this, I want one of you to sort of think about what the other person may like to do in terms of hobbies. Am I making sense? Don't ask that person, what are your hobbies? You come up with the answer according to your perception of that particular person. Am I making sense? Because if they gave you the answer, well, this would not be an activity, right? So just make an effort according to your perception, and actually pick a favorite food. That's a good one, all right? Think about what the other person may like. Oh, she likes Mexican. And then hear from that person what she or he really likes in terms of food, and then vice versa. Okay, so take a 3 minutes. I think this would be able to cover 3 minutes and do this, and then we'll get back with some ideas. All right? So go ahead. So we do go into one. We go into one. Yeah, that's my understanding. Okay, so we have enough time to. We'll have time. Okay, so let's. All right. Go ahead and finish your conversation, and then we'll get back. Well, thank you for doing this. Let's go ahead and hear from you how you felt about the whole process. Give me some ideas. What was it like? What were the dynamics taking place as you were thinking about what the other person liked, and vice versa? I hope you guys got the chance to do that back and forth. Give me some ideas. I'd like to hear from you. Anybody? It's a total guess. And thank you. I could not put it any better. It's a total guess. Is that accurate? It's a total guess, a true thing in terms of information. It's a total guess, right? Anybody else? Anybody else? How did you feel? Yes. Yes, it's uncomfortable. It is. And why is it uncomfortable? It's a total guess and totally wrong, perhaps. Anybody else? Exactly right. This is a true judgment based on what you have in front of you. One more thought, one more idea. Anybody? Yes, sir. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So let me just give you a tool, all right, that has served me well. Perception is not reality, as you know, all right? So there are three things that you can do with a perception. There are three things. One, you can externalize a perception, put it on a table, look at it. If it looks fine, go about your day and live your life that way. Am I making sense? Step number 2, externalize a perception, put it on a table, look at it closely. If you think that perception has 25 or 30% inaccuracy, modify it. Don't be afraid. Modify it. Polish it. And once you are happy with it, bring it back into your system and go about your day and live life that way and be happy. Step number 3. The third thing that you can do is look at your perception, externalize it, put it on a table, look at it through different angles. If you see that perception is totally awkward, it will make you feel uncomfortable if you go along about your day and if you think you are going to get hurt, just get rid of it and replace it with a new working perception. Am I making sense? Now, none of these three things will work if you are not aware of the original perception. Am I making sense? If you are not aware of what you are perceiving, that's not going to work. You're going to continue doing the things that you do, thinking that those are the things that should be done for you and for others. So perception is not reality. So thank you for going with this process. So we have some questions, and we are here to answer them.
Thank you, Oscar. According to Barbara Webster, the single most important aspect of promoting understanding across differences is the understanding of one's own values, beliefs, perspective choices, and early messages about people who are different. Part of that activity was a way to begin to examine some of your perceptions, values, and beliefs. We did this activity because when you sat down with your mentor or mentee for the first time, you may have had some of these thoughts and beliefs, but don't feel bad because they probably had some thoughts and beliefs about you as well. And so it was an opportunity for us to begin to examine and think about that. We're going to spend some time now and ask these two gentlemen a couple questions that's related specifically to your mentoring relationship and things to help assist you in becoming more cultural proficient, if you will, in your mentoring relationship. The first question: what are some ways outside of the mentoring relationship that mentors use to assess their own perceptions about different cultures?
You know, I think the first time when I saw the question, the one word that I would take out is it said discuss. I think one thing that we oftentimes don't do when we look at those different perspectives of different cultures is we don't listen. We don't take in. We always want to give feedback and answer the question. So I think it's listening. I think it's viewing. I think it's reflecting. Sometimes our feelings may disturb us. Like we talked about the assumptions that one of the words somebody said is when we did that activity, you had to make assumptions about individuals. And you get that, when you get that feeling, you're like, I'm making an assumption that's wrong, that's prejudice, that's not the right thing. And I use my daughter for example, is if she walked outside and it was 95 degrees outside and it was somebody in a long black trench coat and a stocking cap, and she runs back in and says, Mommy, Daddy, there's somebody outside, it's not appropriate. Am I gonna put her over my knee? It's probably a bad example with some people, but am I gonna say, you go back out there and give that man a hug? You know, I want her, she needs to be able to make those type of assumptions. But I also need her not only to just discuss, but I also need her to be able to listen. I need her to be able to take things in and then reflect on them to be able to understand different cultural perspectives. And sometimes we don't do a great job of that. And so for me, it wouldn't just always be the ones talking, it would be the ones being able to listen, reflect, view, and digest some of those things that come in.
We want you to mentor. That's what you do best. I am a member of the New Americans Task Force, and at some point in time, we asked a question. We had a survey done for immigrant and refugee families. And we asked that question: as an immigrant and refugee family, what would you like to see happening? What do you need from us? The mainstream culture, all right? And when we got the results from that survey, we were surprised to see that what they want the most is a friend who is white American. Am I making sense? We need your expertise. We need you to guide me and my family in terms of how to navigate your system. We want you to teach me English. We want you to say, you know, Oscar, this is how you pronounce it. We want you to tell us, if you go to Target, this is how you pay. And if you see the doors opening automatically, that's all right. You will not be locked into the store. I mean, we want you to guide us. When it comes to this particular question, we want you to also show that you have certain limitations and that you are a human being just like us. Ask us, Oscar, did I say something that made you uncomfortable? How do you do things in your country? We will gladly guide you through that process. We'll tell you, yes, it is okay to look through the eyes. Or say, you know what, I'm sorry, but we do not look in the eye. That doesn't mean that we are lying. that kind of a cultural perspective. So ask questions, ask us, and then we'll be glad to share with you about who we are.
What are some cultural differences which could potentially affect the development of a mentoring relationship?
Language, food, religion, environment, geographical location, everything. Even amongst yourselves, there are cultural differences that can affect your own communication. So becoming aware. Going back to the first question, becoming aware of the things that you are doing, becoming aware of your own affinity for the person you're trying to work with. Being aware is the single one thing that will help you interact with all people. Being aware and having that thought that, this is a human being. I want to communicate with that human being. I know that person may be totally different than I am, but I am open to the idea of communication. And if I am open to the idea of communication, I'm going to want to know her or want to know him a lot better. I'm going to want to try that food that smells weird and that it may taste awful, but you know what? Pushing myself to do that is going to let that person know that I am willing to learn. That I don't know how else to put it. But.
How can mentors distinguish typical rebellious adolescent behavior from broader cultural differences?
I think this is oftentimes a tough one, but one thing that I reflect back on is saying, okay, that's just kids, and understanding, is that just kids, or is that what all African-American males do, or females, or Latina Hispanics? And one of the things I think we need to understand is we use a term called code switching. And what that is basically, oftentimes it's associated with language, but it's oftentimes associated with behavior. When I come in and I greet Oscar, and Oscar comes up in the morning. Oscar does greet me in the morning, and I see Oscar, and I go ahead and do this on the street, and everybody looks, but my man comes here, and we may just shake hands. A lot of our youth have to code switch on a regular basis, day in and day out. And so when they go home and they're in an environment, they may not be speaking what you may consider proper English. Okay? They may speak in a certain way to their friends or their mom or their dad, and then when you come in for that hour, they're all of a sudden looked at wanting to be themselves, but transitioning so you can, in quote, maybe understand them or be friends, or when you say, hey, you should have said there, not there, or maybe not speak out against your friend. Why didn't you give me that hug that same way when I see, when you see your friends, or you're saying, what's up? Those are type of things. So I think what we need to understand is the difference between a young person who's 13 or 14 years old, okay? And that's just a behavior of their development, of them growing up, but also those cultural things that allow our young people, and honestly, sometimes our adults, to survive in the environments that they're immersed in 23 of the 24 hours a day.
For that particular question, I would say education. There's a lot going on in the world at this point in time. And our students will bring those ideas back into the classrooms, those challenges and those perceptions into the classroom. So what can you do as mentors is become aware of what is going on in the world at this point in time. You may have Arabic students from Iraq and Arabic students from the Kurdish ethnic group in a classroom, and you would be able to sense animosity among themselves. But if you are not aware of what's happening among them in their country, you will miss the whole thing. So education, just being aware of what's happening. The same situation would be with a Burmese student and a Karen student, and speaking same language, but there is a lot behind the scenes that make those communications quite difficult. So education and just being aware will help you with this particular question.
How can mentors help their mentee gain interpersonal and cultural competence?
Be sensitive to the fact that we're going to take time, emotional effort in order to catch up with you. It is your responsibility to show us how things are done in this new culture. Many of us have been placed in Lincoln, Nebraska, not wanting to be here. It will take time for us to make the decision that it is okay to acculturate, that it is okay to speak English, that it is okay to go to a grocery store, and that it is okay to go to a parent-teacher conference. It will take time, and it will take effort on both sides. So just be patient. And we'll get there eventually. It will require sensitivity. It will require you at times to say, I understand. But that's a hard thing to do. Perhaps the hardest thing that you will ever do is to say to yourself, I understand why you do the things that you do. And you know what? I'll wait for you. I'll be here comfortably waiting for you. This is how we do it. I'll mentor you, and I'll just understand.
What are some additional resources that are available to mentors to enhance their cultural competence?
And Oscar will talk a little bit more about the services he provides, but through Lincoln Public Schools, and this is something that you each have access to, we have a youth development team. And these are culturally specific positions that serve some of the scholars that you might be working with. And so we have two student advocates for the African American community, which work throughout the district. We have two Native American advocates. Again, they're divided from the north side and south side of town. We have two transition specialists, which I like to say they work with scholars that are lovingly touched by the juvenile justice system in some form or fashion. So oftentimes those may be coming in from Kearney, Geneva, Boys Town, also may be having some contact with the Attention Center. And then we also have a homeless outreach specialist, which again works across the district. And that homeless component, many think of, you've seen some recent articles, they're living on the street, they're struggling. The homeless definition is lacking fixed or adequate housing. And so oftentimes we'll refer to our scholars are couch surfing. They have those resources. They may not take their whole family in, but they won't have a 12 or 13-year-old out on the street. And so they'll live with a friend. And so if they're not having a stable house where you can say, I'm gonna mail you something to that location, that qualifies somebody as being homeless. And those individuals are culturally specific. They work from a strength-based model. They're able to provide support, resources, and also connections. A lot of those things they talked about, those immersions into the community. They know the demographics. They know the dynamic. They know those families. They know not only their brother, but they know their aunt. They know their uncle. They know the timeline of that individual. And so you may be coming into the picture and with great intentions and providing that relationship that many of our mentees so badly need. But we oftentimes say, you know them, but you may not know them. And so again, they're there to help you know them. They might not be able to tell you all the information, but they can provide you that culturally specific support, maybe that handshake, so to speak. And I'm just being kind of literal on, they're not gonna teach you all the handshakes, but they may say, this is what they're coming to you with. And as Oscar said, is meeting them where they're at. And so when they wanna discuss, you're talking about college and those type of things, they may be able to say, within their family, they are that first generation scholar and they have the ability to go there. But when they go home and are saying to their mom or dad, I met with my teammate mentee, it was awesome, but I'm going to college. And they came back and said, my mom or dad said, that's great. But they said, if you want me to go to college, you pay for it. They can explain and help you navigate that and say, what? Bill Bryant goes into that home with that mentee and says, what? Their mentor was talking about going to college. They really know what they're about. They basically are the ones that sign off and they validate. They give you your street cred, so to speak. And so how can these individuals be accessed? You can call the TeamMates office. We have a list of who all these individuals are. They're readily available. They're in the schools on a regular basis. So all you have to do is say, is there an advocate that may be working with my scholar? Because many of our advocates may have referred them for a teammate or may be working with a scholar that you may have. And so they might mention, I have a student advocate. I have a bilingual liaison that I trust, and that name may not be ringing a bell. So when you ask in the office or you ask, your teammate, your liaison in that building, they can say, that's who this individual is. And they can do some of that awareness, have that discussion when you're talking about what are some boundaries, what are some limitations, what are some cultural things that I might be missing. So that's a resource that the district has and they do provide. And they are open and willing and they are very appreciative of the relationships that you, each and every one of you have with your mentees.
At this point in time, I want to invite you all to take advantage of these resources that we have available. I want to collaborate with each one of you. We have 18 bilingual liaisons from all walks of life, speaking more than 10 different languages. At this point in time, they are everywhere in this district. And you can have access to their knowledge and expertise in the area of their own cultural perspectives. I would be glad to read an email from any of you saying, Oscar, Pete, I have this cultural question for you guys. Can you guide me to the right bilingual liaison or the appropriate student advocate, because I want to be informed. We talked about education and being aware of what's happening in the world at this point in time. There's one piece of information that is very important to bring up, and this is the mental health of the students that you are working with, because that's going to generate a few other challenges. Or bilingual liaisons, student advocates may be able to help you understand what it is that these students have been through in their own countries, to a certain extent, of course. But we have that information. I can send a list of bilingual liaisons. Well, actually, you can look it up on the LPS website in federal programs. So don't be afraid to communicate with us.
Thank you for your responses. Now we're going to take time to show a short 7-minute video from the TED Talk series.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2. Although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer, and when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow, They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria, I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow, we ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination, they opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. And if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story, as had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I, too, am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now, this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Tylan, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Okoloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete.